Welcome to the National Press Club, the place where news happens. I'm Lisa Matthews, Vice President of the National Press Club and Assignment Manager for U.S. Video at the Associated Press. Thank you for joining us today for our virtual Headliners Newsmaker with Rick Wilson and Steve Schmidt, co-founders of the Lincoln Project. We are happy to accept questions from our audience today, and I will ask as many questions as time permits. To submit a question, please email headliners@press.org. We're 40 days away from Election Day, and as in presidential campaigns past, the two candidates, Republican incumbent President Donald Trump and Democratic challenger former Vice President Joe Biden, are spending millions on advertising to spread their message and turn the tide in battleground states. But this election is also rather unusual. Certainly the COVID-19 pandemic is squelching the usual campaign trail meet and greets and rallies. And then there's the Lincoln Project, a political action committee founded by several current and former influential Republicans, including Attorney George Conway, New Hampshire GOP Chair Jennifer Horn, Republican political strategist Reed Galen, Mike Madrid, Ron Steslow, and John Weaver, and our guests here today, Rick Wilson and Steve Schmidt. A Republican PAC founded by a bunch of Republicans doesn't sound that unusual, but unlike traditional Republican PACs, the Lincoln Project is spending millions to defeat the Republican presidential candidate and his supporters in the Senate. Today, the two Lincoln Project founders, Rick Wilson and Steve Schmidt, will give us an update on the state of the 2020 race and the Lincoln Project's homestretch strategy. Rick got his start as a political strategist in the 1988 presidential campaign of George H.W. Bush and has since provided strategic counsel to political candidates, super PACs, state parties, national campaign committees, and corporate association and government clients. He is also the editor-at-large for the Daily Beast and a frequent analyst on CNN and MSNBC, and is the author of the 2018 #1 New York Times best-selling book, Everything Trump Touches Dies. Steve is a communications and public affairs strategist and a political analyst for MSNBC and NBC News. He has served as a political strategist for George W. Bush, Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Senator John McCain. He called himself a Republican until June 2018, when he renounced the Republican Party as fully the party of Trump. So, welcome to the National Press Club, gentlemen.
It's good to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
I'm so glad to have you. And since we were talking a little earlier before we started, and Steve was talking about intuition, I want to know, between the two of you, when did you have the intuition, or when did you realize that you needed to create the Lincoln Project? We want to know who called who. You know, who sent the first email? Who sent the first meme? What's the background?
Well, we were all talking to each other going back to 2018, and we almost kicked off an effort late in the 2018 cycle, but just didn't think we had the time to do it competently. And so we kept talking, and we decided to launch it in December of 19, and we were really alarmed watching the Democratic debates because there was a name that was very infrequently heard, and that name was Trump. And Trump's no Voldemort. We think that he is the race, that he is the first issue in the race, the second issue in the race, the tertiary issue in the race, and the next 155 after that. And so we have a point of view that what this race is about is the worst president in the history of the country. Now, that was before COVID. And so now what we know is that Donald Trump's lie to the country, which he's told on at least 120 different occasions, which is that the virus was a hoax, it was created by the Democrats, it would just go away. It is, without question, the most lethal lie in American history. If we had the same mortality rates in the United States that Germany did, there'd be 150,000 more Americans alive today. The consequence of that lie has devastated the economy. It's broken a million dreams, shattered the American dream for millions of small businesses. It's disrupted the education for every kid in this country. And it has wrecked the American way of life. Grandparents can't go see their grandkids being born. Christenings and baptisms and bar mitzvahs and first communions, not this year. Weddings, tailgates, football, proms, it's all gone. And it's because of Donald Trump. On top of it, by the time we get to the end of COVID, it may be that it kills 1 out of every 1,500 Black people in this country. That is a staggering number that speaks to the profound inequities that exist in our society, from access to medical care to economic inequality. And Trump is the biggest problem that the country faces and the most easy one to fix. And what was true about the 2016 election was that whomever that election was about was the person who was losing the election. And for 99% of the election, it was about Trump, until James Comey made it about Hillary Clinton in the last week. And by 78,000 votes across 3 states, Trump won. And our point of view has always been, it's about Trump.
Let me ask you, Steve and Rick, why didn't you guys do something back in 2016? I'm just curious about that. Because if he's a problem.
Well, we all did. We all tried different approaches in 2016. And unfortunately, there were 2 big problems. First off, Trump had a divided field of 15 Republican candidates, all of whom he slowly devoured. And the second part of 2016 was this was running against Hillary Clinton, who has this almost demonic iconographic role in the Republican political psyche. And so there were an awful lot of Republicans that we tried to reach who said things like, well, I vote with you guys, or I vote against Trump, but it's Hillary. I can't not vote against Hillary. And so this chaos level and this intensity level of all these Republican voters became very marked and increasingly problematic in 16. All of us tried different approaches with either candidates or super PACs in 2016. And it was just a moment where the party's moral collapse was happening. And it took us, even all of us who are pretty, experienced, we've been around the block a few times, to recognize the degree to which the moral and political collapse of the party was occurring right before our eyes. And these were people who had once said that they believed in the Constitution and the rule of law, that they believed in individual liberty, that they believed in all the fundamental predicates of America. And what happened was that turned out to have been a complete illusion that they have adopted. They eagerly jumped into this authoritarian personality cult of Donald Trump.
So
I would just add 2 things to that. That I said over the 16 election, and I was an analyst on MSNBC on a network, but I said 2 things in 16. First thing I said was the observation that in the 1930s, fascism didn't rise because it was strong, but rather because democracy was weak. And the second thing I said is that I thought that there was a real lack of imagination within the American mind about the capacity for someone like Donald Trump sitting behind the Resolute desk in the Oval Office to cause a profound tragedy. And I think both of those things hold true. Now, both Rick and I were unapologetically tough on Trump for the duration of the 16 race. And what's different between today and then is you would have a lot of Republican senators and governors who weren't saying it themselves, but were calling and saying, keep it up, attaboy, good job, right? That's important, couldn't agree more. And one by one, what we watched for 2 years is the total capitulation to Trump. And on a 4-year basis, I think it's important to understand what occurred. And you can understand that through the Republican convention. And what you saw at the Republican convention was the 3rd oldest political party in the world. The Democrats are the first, and the British Labour Party the second. The British Tory Party the second. what you saw there was the party platform become a statement of obedience and loyalty to Trump. That to be a Republican in good standing requires faithfulness to a cult of personality. And so what did you see at that convention? You saw at that convention breathtaking lying that you've never seen at any convention. You saw utter lawlessness, the use of taxpayer dollars and public property for his political purposes. You saw the seizure of important symbols of the Republic by Trump, who turned them into partisan totems and expressions of his authority, in essence declaring, I am the truth, I am the law, I am the state.
Okay, so Steve,
And that now we see with Trump saying, hey, maybe we'll have a peaceful transition of power, maybe we won't, without much pushback from formerly people who called themselves small c conservatives.
right. So let's talk about that, because obviously there's something going on in the Senate right now. And what is it that you guys think is happening with some of the traditional Republicans who have not spoken up, who have not spoken out against President Trump?
Well, I can summarize it in one word. It's cowardice. These are people who are afraid of a mean tweet, and they're afraid of Trump's base, and they're afraid of Fox News, and that fear defines their whole character now. And whether it's Marco Rubio or Josh Hawley or Ted Cruz or Mike Lee or Rand Paul or anyone else in the Senate, these days the one thing they care about is avoiding Donald Trump's ire. They have sold themselves out cheaply to him. They can never be trusted or believed ever again, because the response to a president saying, I'm agnostic about whether I'm going to have a peaceful transition of power, and the response to a president who turns uniform, anonymous federal forces on peaceful protesters is not a Bible verse being tweeted out or an elliptical statement or saying, oh, I haven't seen his tweet. The response of, if they were men and women of integrity and honor, they would be furious. They would be defending this country. They would be defending our freedoms, our Constitution, the predicates around it. They would be standing up against rampant abuse of executive power, and they're not. They are too afraid. They are too sold out to do that.
So are we going to see a new justice put in place? Is that going to happen? Do you guys think that's going to happen?
We may well. We may well.
Probably. But look, it's, I ran 2 Supreme Court confirmations when I was in the Bush administration for Roberts and Alito. And I was asked by my friend Stephanie Cutter to be publicly supportive in the Obama administration of Sotomayor and Kagan, which I am. There are consequences to presidential elections. The defeat of or the refusal to give a duly appointed nominee of an incumbent president a hearing, Garland, renders this appointment illegitimate. And we look at this moment right now. I mean, this is precisely what James Madison wrote about in Federalist 10, when he talks about the danger of parties and factions, right, and majoritarianism. And the question here is, Republicans can go out there and say, hey, listen, we lied, screw you, we're in charge now, we're pushing it through. You can say that. You can say, listen, we made a mistake. We now realize like how important these nominees are, so we got to put the conservative on. I guess you can say that. What you can't say, right, is that it's in the public good, right? And that's what Federalist 10 is about, is what the public good, right, is endangered by faction, right, that assails and assaults minority rights, right? And the Democrats represent, right, a majority of the country by popular vote in a presidential election, and a majority of the country by popular vote representation in the Senate. So this is a moment when you look at the divisions in the country where if we had moral or competent political leadership, there would be an understanding that this is a moment for restraint. That's what wisdom would dictate. We're not going to see that. Now, so as a tactical matter, right? Derailing a Supreme Court nomination, stopping it, is not unlike robbing a train, right? If you want to go into the train robbery business, right, the first thing you got to figure out before you can get to the safe on the train is how to stop the train, how to slow it down, how to get on the train. And that's what Democrats have to be thinking about right now.
So how
If you
should
slow it down by an hour, slow it down. Slow it down, slow it down, slow it down.
okay, choo-choo. How should the Democrats be perceiving the Lincoln Project? I mean, we're getting tons of questions in. Is the Lincoln Project allies? Are you guys allies of convenience right now? Or are there tips that you have for the Democratic Party that they should be taking from you? How should Democrats view the Lincoln Project?
We're part of a broad coalition that views Donald Trump as an existential threat to this country. And we do not have to agree on every single philosophical or political prior. We don't have to agree on every single policy question. Yeah, Steve and I often joke about this. We'd love to be back fighting again if whether the marginal tax rate is going to be 38.6% or 34.9%. That'd be a fantastic world to live in a lot of ways. But we're here because we have a collective set of skills and abilities and a collective set of experiences that have made us effective in moving voters in this country. And we have identified, and I wrote a book about it, the Democrats often fall into simple traps, and they often fall into simple mistakes in campaigns. And, we've kept this race as a referendum on Donald Trump. It is a yes-no choice. It's not an argument about climate change or guns or abortion or anything else. It's an argument about Donald Trump. He is the worst president in American history. And it's a choice. Do you want 4 more years of that, or do you want to make a change and do something else? So, we're happy to work with and alongside people. When we started this whole process, there were people that were behind us, to the side of us, ahead of us. We were ahead for a long time. But now we're working inside of a broad coalition. And frankly, the most interesting thing isn't just the Democratic groups that are sort of tuning up and getting tighter in their messaging and more sharp in their advertising. It's also the emergence now of a number of Republican-centric groups that are coming into this race, and they're pushing the same sort of objections to Trump from the right and the center that we feel like we've played.
I just want to add a couple points to that. Is that we view ourselves as a pro-democracy organization. And, historically, my view has always been that the Republican and the Democratic parties are two of the most important institutions, not just in our country's history, but in world history, for the advancement of human dignity and freedom, which is why I never have and have always hated when Republicans call the Democratic Party the Democrat Party, because it implies a level of disrespect for one of our greatest American institutions, and the party should be called by its name, which is the Democratic Party. And that party, the Democratic Party, is the only political party out of the 2 major parties we have that's fidelitous in this moment to the ideas and ideals of the country, to American democracy. Trumpism is an illiberal and authoritarianish ideology. We should make no mistake about it, with its hostility to our freedoms, to the First Amendment, to the elections process, and all of it. And we are an organization now that has several million followers, that has close to 500,000 donors, that is raised substantial resources to fight back against Trumpism. And so when I say Trumpism, we mean that as a rooted ideology, right? Something that wasn't 4 years ago, but has become so. And when Republicans lose, and I think that Biden will win, and I think that the Democrats will take the Senate majority, today at least. But if Republicans do lose, what will happen to the party can be understood by observing what happened to the California party. As political parties shrink, they are like white stars collapsing astronomically. They become smaller, they become denser, and they become hotter. And so the Republican Party, as it shrinks, is becoming more extreme. So one of the things that is always misanalyzed, if that's a word, in the press, is Trump has 96% support in the Republican Party. True. However, that party is substantially smaller than it was a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. What will happen if Trump loses? He's not going away. Trumpism isn't going away. You'll see a more extreme ideology. You'll see more QAnon candidates. So in that space for a long time, we're on the side of the Liberty Party in the country. And second to that, and I'll just 30 more seconds, it seems to us as a matter of principle that we need to have a new Voting Rights Act in this country, a new Civil Rights Act in this country. We need to have an Election Security and Foreign Interference Act. We need fundamental ethics reform. We need fundamental civil service reform. We need to see immigration reform finally passed. We will be an organization that supports Vice President Biden in any of these things.
Okay.
As an American organization who understands that we are in an hour of crisis and decline and danger in this country because of Trump and the cowardice of the Republican Party that has refused to exercise their power to put a check on him, from his indecency to his abuses of power.
Is it time for a third party in the United States?
You know, we say this a lot. We're not in the party building business right now. We're in the democracy business. We think largely that this country needs viable political parties. And if you have the broad argument that the Democrats are a progressive political party or a liberal political party, the idea of having a center-right party that believes in the things the Republican Party claimed it represented is very appealing. And so we don't know what the end of this election cycle looks like, but we do know, as Steve said, we're going to be stuck with Trumpism for a while. There will be a battle on the right between nationalist populism that's based in both authoritarianism and racially charged politics, and a party about economic liberty and individual freedom. What that looks like, I don't know. I don't think Steve knows. I don't think any of us really know, because Donald Trump has really fundamentally poisoned the brand of the Republican Party. They may emerge as a Trumpian party. They may emerge as a party that looks like something we haven't really seen in our politics before, a dynastic political party defined as adherence to one family. And even though people who used to say, the Bushes have been around for too long, the Kennedys have been around for too long, those people all had a certain modesty about their public service. They all had a certain degree to which they acted as servant leaders. These people act as parasites on the American body politic. And I think it's very likely that we're going to see the Republican Party in 2024 look at Donald Trump Jr. as the lead candidate for their nomination. And I think that is a terrifying prospect if you're a free market conservative, if you're an individual liberty conservative. But if you are part of the personality cult, that sounds like a great idea. So is there time for a third party? Can't say yet. But I do think the Republican Party has taken a poison pill with Donald Trump.
Let's talk.
We don't have a center right party in the country anymore. We still do have a center to center left party in the country. And right, if that collapsed, right, and so we have this authoritarian-ish nationalist party on the right that I'll come back to something in a second, and you have a collapse of a center left centrist party on the left, and it's a socialist party versus that, then I don't know what happens, right? There could be an independent candidate that could win, certainly. But look, that Republican coalition now, right? I mean, fully 25 to 27% of this country is deeply enmeshed in a cult of personality. They'll never accept the legitimacy of the outcome of the election. Trump will never cede the legitimacy of an election that he loses. We have if you look at Louisville, right? What I'm watching on TV is I'm watching armed white people with assault weapons, tactical gear on, walking unencumbered around Louisville. Somebody, a lot of them with Trump hats on, somebody needs to explain to me, and I say this with no hyperbole, but someone needs to explain to me what the difference between that and the early, am I looking at the early days of Trump's essay? What's the difference?
Well, Kentucky.
Right. What's the difference?
Well, Kentucky state laws allow them to do that. So, but I hear you.
Good. Let me just say the governor has discretion, right, to protect law and order and public good, right, to say no. Not today, right? It's not a protest march. It's an incendiary situation.
Right.
And we've seen it all over the country, right? The storming of the Michigan State Capitol. So I'm just saying, right, maybe it is lawful, but it's dangerous. And we should talk about it.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the Senate races, because we've gotten quite a few questions in about people are curious what races you're concentrating on. Which states are going to flip? Who are you concentrating on in the Senate races?
Lincoln Project loves Dr. Al in Alaska. We think we feel really good about Dr. Al. Rick, why don't you talk a little bit about Dr. Al?
Rick, you're muted.
Sorry.
There you go.
You've got a candidate in Al Gross who is quintessentially Alaska. He is both a commercial fisherman and an orthopedic surgeon. He is a guy who, in a moment of being attacked by a bear, killed a bear. He is a big, bold character, and he represents the sort of essential independent character of that state. Dan Sullivan is a standard issue cookie cutter Republican. You could line him up with 10 other Republican state U.S. senators, and you could swap them out like Legos. Al is a big, like I said, a big, bold character. We like his chances a lot. We're also working in Montana to help Governor Steve Bullock take the U.S. Senate seat from Steve Daines, another guy you could put could have been punched out of a factory to look the same as every other. We've been active in Maine, of course, with Sue Collins, who has continually broken her oath, continually deceived the people of Maine about her intentions on votes again and again and again. And we realized with the people of Maine, her act has grown very thin. The whole, I'm so concerned, I'm so worried, I've got a furrowed brow, I don't know what I'm going to do, and then she votes for Trump every single time. I think Mainers have reached their limit on that. We're also active in. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, what about Lindsey Graham? What about Rand Paul? Where are you going there?
Well, we're not active in Rand's race, of course, because that's not one of the viable races. It's not on the cycle. But right. Lindsey Graham, and I'm sure Steve will speak more to Lindsey. We have hit Lindsey Graham very hard. We've helped bring Jamie Harrison up. We think basically to even. We're in our second $1 million investment in South Carolina. And it's one of the great things about Jamie Harrison is he is a person who is frankly more conservative than Lindsey Graham on some big issues. And I'll tell you what one of those is: spending. Lindsey Graham, for 30 years of his career, was a budget hawk, a fiscal discipline guy, and suddenly Donald Trump's in office and he's spending money like a drunken socialist sailor. There's nothing he won't do to back up whatever spending Trump wants to do. And so when you see a Jamie Harrison who is more conservative than Lindsey Graham on spending, on free trade, on many foreign policy issues, including Lindsey Graham has just joined the Trump train, and he's fidelitous to Russia and Putin first. He won't defend this country on those things. And so we're really optimistic about Jamie Harrison. It's a tough seat. It's a tough race. But it is one that deserves a lot of attention because Lindsey Graham is a person of the lowest moral character in the Senate. One of the races I want to mention that I'll let Steve talk is Mike Espy in Mississippi is now tied with Cindy Hyde-Smith. This is something, if a year ago you told me that there would be a tie race for U.S. Senate in Mississippi, I would have told you were out of your mind. But the landscape is shifting very quickly. North Carolina, we feel, is pretty much gone for the Republicans. Colorado and Arizona are in terrible shape for the Republicans. So we feel like this is a hell of a landscape right now.
Okay,
I'll just say one more thing real quick about the Alaska race is so Alaska, one, is an overwhelmingly pro-choice state, and so this Supreme Court confirmation, I think, is it may be that Trump gets the justice on the court, but it's going to be devastating politically in November for a couple of reasons. But in that Alaska race, it's going to hurt Sullivan. And then there's another issue up there, which is something called the Pebble Mine. And the Pebble Mine has been a hugely controversial gold mine that will poison the headwaters of Bristol Bay and the largest, richest salmon fishery in the world. Dr. Al's against it. Sullivan is for the mine. State is overwhelmingly against it, and we're going to kill Sullivan on that issue. Coming soon. And we look at the Lindsey Graham race. We're just going to go for it. We think that he is the most undeserving senator in the country. His character is loathsome. He's a principleless man, utterly self-interested. Hypocritical, and the idea that Lindsey Graham has anyone's back is ludicrous. I'd like to say something about a message that you'll see from us in the Senate races, in part, which is the indictment, which is this, and I think this is an important thing. And we try to always be proportional when we say the worst of, or he's this, or he's that, or the biggest. And we're very cognizant when we say these things that, everybody tends to, oh, it's the greatest party, it was the best movie, it's the best of times, worst of times, because it's proximate to our presence in those events, right? And everything is self-referential. But the magnitude of Trump's lie is so great and the consequences so deadly and so severe. Every one of these senators, every one of them knew how deadly this was. They also knew, every one of them, that Trump knew how deadly this was.
You're referring to the pandemic. You're referring to the pandemic.
I'm talking to the pandemic.
Okay.
Not one of them, not one, went to the floor of the Senate and gave a speech and said, Mr. President, stop this insanity. Not one of them went into the Oval Office and banged a hand on the Resolute desk and say, stop this. But now every one of them is running for re-election under the premise of vote for me. I'm an independent voice. I'll have your back. Like there's a phraseology from the colorful colloquialisms of my native people in New Jersey that goes something like, go yourself, which is the only appropriate answer to that, ask on the part of these, incumbents. But, we're going to go for it in the South Carolina race. And we like what we're seeing in this SB race.
Yeah,
and,
really got our attention.
And I think in the SB race, Confederate battle flag came down this year. Stuart Stevens, who works with us, is obviously a Mississippi native, but Mississippi, they have a nut senator who embarrasses the state, right? Makes them a joke, right? And if Mississippi wants to kind of step forward away from being the punchline, right? The way that Alabama did with Judge Roy Moore, then SB's the candidate, and he's right there. And so we're probably going to play hard in that race and go at her.
So Vice President Biden has signaled that he would not interfere with New York's Southern District prosecuting Donald Trump post-presidency, should he win. So what do you think the impact on the country and the government would be if this were to happen?
Look, as long as the work of the Southern District is not influenced by some external political, some exogenous political motivation, it should not matter, because no one, including a former president, should be above the law. No one should be protected by the Justice Department from prosecution if they have committed actionable crimes. But the flip side of this is that we're right now in a country where Donald Trump wants the Justice Department to both defend him and attack his enemies. He has said repeatedly that somebody should be investigated, so-and-so should be taken out, lock her up, those sort of things. And those things are anathema to a constitutional government. Those things are anathema to the American form of government. I don't want the heavy hand of politics weighing on either side of any prosecution in this country.
So talk to us
I
about,
think the only
go ahead,
the only
Steve.
thing I would say the only thing worse than one political party, that's embraced the lock them up philosophy is is two political parties that embrace it.
Right.
And so, I agree with everything Rick said about accountability under the law, but part of our vestigial small c conservatism is we're rooted in pragmatism. And
Yep.
look, it's any considered prosecution of Trump. I hope the people that are considering it in those positions approach it from a frame of wisdom and restraint, with a vision of we have to move beyond this. And it's going to take a long time to move beyond it, and we don't want to exacerbate it. And we got a big problem in this country. And the big problem is that we got 30% of the country that's completely checked out of reality, that surrendered themselves to a cult of personality, that is manipulated, politicized, and increasingly extreme, and is illiberal, right? Is faithless to a kind of core concept about it's a government of the people, by the people, for the people, not a government for the advancement of the leader.
So
Right?
talk to me,
They've lost contact with our democratic values.
talk to us a little bit about the role that the Justice Department and Bill Barr is playing in the lead up to the election right now, in your view.
Well, he's like America's first interior minister.
Yeah, it is a horrifying prospect that you have the Attorney General of the United States declaring municipalities as anarchist territories, anarchist-controlled cities, in order to engage in a political stunt to assist the Trump campaign to turn out their base. It is horrifying that you have the Attorney General of the United States seeking to defend the president, to use the resources of the federal government to defend the president in a sexual assault case from before his time in office. It is horrifying that you have Bill Barr going out there and attempting to quash the publication of books that have already gone through the legitimate security review process because they contain information that is not classified but rather embarrassing to the president and reflective of his low character. The list of things that Bill Barr is engaged in terms of trying to put out the Durham report to smear the investigation into Donald Trump's connections to the Russians, and a host of other things, including distorting and lying about the contents of the Mueller report and blocking the release of grand jury testimony relevant to Congress about it. There's a full spectrum in which we will look back at Donald Trump as the worst president in American history. We will look back on Bill Barr as a reckless and absolutely lawless individual who was determined to break the role of the Justice Department as a fairly independent part of the executive branch and turn it into the Trump family's personal arm, legal and political arm.
So
I think it's also, I'm sorry, Lisa.
it's all good, Steve. Go ahead.
No, I think like we need to understand something too, like the ability to recognize that you're in a pot and the water's getting hotter, right? And for us not to be the proverbial frogs. And right, so in that sense, right, it means something, right? When Mitt Romney accurately and correctly calls out the work of a Senate chairman, Ron Johnson, who's using his committee for political purposes, partisan purposes, which is inappropriate, but specifically the partisan purpose to attack the candidacy of the Democratic nominee using Russian disinformation, which is what it is, right? So what happens, right, when you start using the instruments of the state in pursuit of your policy objectives to punish your opponents, right? The point about Ukraine, which I thought was profoundly underemphasized in the coverage with regard to Trump's shakedown, is this. If the president or his administration can try to instigate a criminal investigation based on bullshit against the former vice president of the United States,
right,
they can do that to anybody. And so we're at a line where it's only inches now to cross into the territory where you will see, right, if there's a second Trump term, the use of these institutions overtly, not in defense of, but for the purposes of punishment for his political opponents. And you're going to see that.
So you'll
see him using the instances of the Justice Department, the tax authorities, and others to do just that.
Right. So you gave us a look into your crystal ball, and you basically said that you think Joe Biden's going to win, that they're going to flip the Congress. How much of I'm getting lots of questions in. How big of a margin do you think Biden would need to win in order, and you already said that Trump's not going to accept the win, but how big of a margin does he need, I guess, for there to be public acceptance of the win? And where does the Electoral College come in there as well?
Well, the Electoral College is the only thing that matters. It is. You know what? Joe Biden could win by 40 million popular votes, and if Donald Trump wins the Electoral College, we're going to be in the fight forever. He'll never, or it's close in the Electoral College. It'll never go away. So it has to be a decisive Electoral College victory, and I mean that, you know, it can't be like separated by 20 or 30 Electoral College votes. It needs to be significant, or Trump is going to try to do what he does.
So what's significant?
And break the norms.
What's significant, Rick? I mean, that's what
I'd like to
know.
see Joe Biden somewhere in the 340 range. It's a lot. That's a reach. It's a big jump, but we need to have a decisive victory to break the back of Trumpism. You have to make it so big that they can't cheat.
Right. So what's your war chest?
Florida's really important here.
Florida's huge.
Yeah, absolutely. What's your war chest looking like now leading up to the end of the election?
We're going to be somewhere around, by the end of this cycle, we'll raise somewhere around $60 to $65 million, maybe a little north of that if we continue on our pace. And we're going to be ready to deploy very significant resources into the states in the closing weeks.
We know Michael Steele joined the Lincoln Project just recently. Are there any additional folks who, any names that have joined that we don't know about, who are lending huge support, Republicans that won't mind being named?
I was just what you were saying that. It's not like getting into Harvard or anything, right?
Our hazing, we don't really even haze anymore. I mean, easiest frat on campus.
Okay, all right. Well, I've got two more questions for you. Before I get to that, before I ask my final question, I want to send a shout out to all of the folks who helped organize today's panel. You guys have been really great. The Headliners co-team leaders, Donna Linewan-Leger and Lori Russo, Headliners team member and National Press Club Governor Danny Selnick, who organized today's event, our club communications director Lindsay Underwood, and club executive director Bill McCarran. So, my fun questions to end this. First, if 2020 was a horror movie, what movie would it be? Steve.
The movie that always terrified me the most, and is just because, and the figure reminds me of Trump, was Chucky. I just feel like I'm trapped in the house and there's this little orange guy running around all the time with the knife, trying to get you.
Okay, Rick. Horror movie.
For me, it's The Shining. All work and no play makes Donald a dull boy.
Oh, that's so good. And it looks like actually we have more time than I thought we were going to have. So I've got time for one more question. I can't get over the Chucky vision in my head right now, Steve. Thanks for that. That's
right?
That's really special.
You asked the question.
I sure did. Okay. Another question is, you know, you guys said that you're like a coalition of many. And frankly, I have to say, Steve, when you were talking, you sounded like you've been talking to Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, because you like basically spit out a number of the topics that they claim to be very, very concerned about. So I guess what I'm saying is how much in common do you have with the Democratic Party, and moving down the line, you know, what recommendations do you have for the party itself? That's my earpiece coming out.
Look, I believe this. I believe this with all my heart. We have much more in common than we do in disagreement as Americans. The national motto, e pluribus unum, out of many one. We have to reconnect to the centrality of this idea. You know, you think about the nation's greatest president, and you consider that 600,000 people were killed in a war that was fought in a nation where there were 25 million in the North, and there were 9 million in the South, 5 million white, 4 million slave. And he talked at the end of the war about charity for all and malice towards none, to care for the widow and the orphan, and to bind up the wounds of the nation. And you look at what's going on in Louisville. A moral president would be with the governor of the state, maybe on the ground, with McConnell, with black church leaders, with leaders of the black community, calling for calm, not rooting for the flames to start. And so we need a leadership in this country that's like devoted now pragmatically to fixing problems. You know, look, I was always of the wing of the Republican Party, right? That I was a Republican because I worried Democrats would bankrupt the country. But I don't know what any of that means anymore, right, in a month where Republicans are spending $3 trillion. I mean, there is no limited government, you know, party in this country, and you know that's why we need some sort of center right, you know, some sort of center right movement. But like, look, this pandemic is one of the great crises in the history of this country. We have to get through this, and we have to rebuild our economy, and we have to look now, all of us, right at the 20-year mark of the 21st century. How's it going? The country's in decline, and we have a decayed and rotten political class, and we have some real issues of income inequality that are not so different than what Teddy Roosevelt was dealing with 120, 115, 110 years ago. When you look at companies like Facebook and others, we have a right as a people to decide how big, how powerful, how injurious these companies get to be. And there's going to be a lot of issues that we have to discuss. You look at the beginning of the era of artificial intelligence, the dislocation that's coming from technology. We have enormous issues in this country, and we can't stay on this path. This has been a tragic 4 years. And so if it sounds like I have things in common with Nancy Pelosi, maybe it's nothing more than a recognition of both reality and problems, and the understanding that we have to get back to the ability to sit in a room across from each other and do business with each other. And we ought to be able to think about this country in longer than 2-week increments. And I'll just say one last thing in conclusion. I was reading this Axios last week, and it was trying to interpret who was up and who is down on the COVID negotiations between the Senate, the House leadership, and the White House. And it was well written, but the explication of it was like something from the Beautiful Mind movie with the math formulas on the blackboard. I say that as someone who lives in Utah, right? The take on this from inside the Beltway, trying to explain, and the House Democrats did this and shafted the Senate Republicans who did this, and you're like, holy shit, stop it. Stop it. right? Is it's what the country's screaming for. And so yeah, right, we have a couple million people and a 500,000 donors who put real money into this, and we want to be a force for good, about moving stuff forward in this country again. And we got to get out of this disaster.
Go, Rick.
I just want to add one thing to what Steve mentioned just now, and I think he made excellent points across the board. The first 2 years of the Biden administration are not going to be marked by the Green New Deal or any other damn thing. They're going to be marked by getting this country tuned up to respond to a COVID pandemic that Donald Trump absolutely mismanaged to fatal consequences. It's not going to immediately change. The lights aren't going to flick on the morning he sits there behind the Resolute desk and all be better. He's going to have 2 years of very, very, maybe more, of very, very hard work ahead of him before we can even start to go back to having the old ideological fights. The response to COVID has to be economic, it has to be humanitarian, it has to be, it has to be scientific. And those things are going to eat up the vast majority. And in some ways, a president who is tested by a giant crisis can become one of the greats, okay? A president who is tested by something so overwhelming can become a great president. Donald Trump was tested by this and failed. He will be remembered. He will be humiliated by history. He will be the worst of all our presidents for as long as this country survives. But Joe Biden has a moment, but it's going to require more than ideology. It's going to require dedication and competence and a belief that the people of this country deserve leadership that's honest, that's even-handed, that's committed to the fundamental predicates and principles of this country, and is willing to do the hard work. I'm going to predict you're not going to see Joe Biden out on the golf course 3 times a week. I'm going to predict you're not going to see Joe Biden out there, picking bullshit fights with reporters every day. But he's going to have to strap down and get the work done. And like I said, it's my doctrine of radical competence that's going to be something I think will mark the way the future looks if it's going to be a successful Biden presidency.
I realize that I have not asked the question that I should have asked at the beginning. What about Kanye West? What about Kanye West?
I'm not saying he's a gold digger, but the amount of resources that the Trump campaign clearly put into trying to get Kanye on the ballot in some of these states, and the way that they completely botched it in these states, it's both cynical and horrible and hilarious in equal mixture.
Last night I was going through some of my emails, and I was looking at the pool report from when the president came in, and something that he said, he was asked what his message is after the Breonna Taylor ruling. And Steve, since you've gone back to Louisville a couple times, I just want to mention this. President Trump said, quote, "Well, my message is that I love the Black community, and I've done more for the Black community than any other president. And I say, with the possible exception of Abraham Lincoln, and I made opportunity zones, and with criminal justice reform, with prison reform, and what we've done for historically Black colleges, universities, nobody has done more. Abraham Lincoln, let's give him a nod," he added. "But beyond that, nobody's done more. I love the Black community." So in the midst of the pandemic and everything that we're looking at, and I think about something that my mom told me, back in the day, many Blacks used to vote Republican. So what's your message to Black Americans who support Donald Trump, and to Black Americans who might be confused about where they're going and what's going to happen after the election?
Well, look, I think, with regard to Trump's comments, right? Like there's an old saying that I remember my dad teaching me, right? Is you can't fix stupid and you can't fix crazy. And he's both. And I think that he is overtly stoking racial animus in this country, the likes of which we've not seen since George Wallace was on the scene. We saw, and what I would say to anyone, and I would never deign to speak for the black community, but I would say this. So there was a couple that appeared at the Republican National Convention named the McCloskeys. And who are the McCloskeys? Well, the McCloskeys live next door to a synagogue, and the children of the synagogue, of the shul, put together honeybee hives to grow honey for Rosh Hashanah. And apparently the hives were slightly over the property line. And so what did Mr. McCloskey do? Did he call the synagogue? Did he say, hey, this bothers me, it's over my property line? No, he went back there with an axe and he destroyed the hives. And so when peacefully marching black protesters came by his house, him and his wife came out and pointed recklessly firearms that they obviously from the pictures had no idea how to handle at the black protesters. And for the achievement of pointing guns at black people, they were given a primetime speaking address at the Republican National Committee, where they talked about how black and brown people would soon be invading America. Later that evening, Matt Gaetz incited people, this dystopic culture war with black and brown people storming. And then the next day, a 17-year-old in Illinois took his AR-15, went to Kenosha, Wisconsin, and he shot 3 people. And make no mistake about it, that kid who sat in the front row of a Trump rally was radicalized by Trumpism. He was radicalized by the voices of InfoWars and OANN and Facebook and Fox News and the McCloskeys and all of it. And when he says there's good people on both sides of the debate, he has been inimically hostile to civil rights, to equal rights. And what I would say to any young black man is to understand the case from when I was a young man at age 18 of the Central Park Five. Right? What Trump is for is not in anybody's interest in the country. And he's obviously has a lot of animus in his heart based on his actions. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a psychologist. You know, on any of these things. But what I would say to anybody is this about Joe Biden, and I this conversation's going on, and Rick and I talk about this a lot, and I'm not immune to it either. The strength of the Biden campaign is being underreported by the media, and the frailty of the Trump campaign is being underreported because no one wants to be wrong 2 elections in a row, right? With 16, and I get it. Human nature's human nature on this, but if I can just tell like a quick story. At the beginning of the Civil War, William Tecumseh Sherman wrote a letter to a friend talking about that the country was doomed, that Abraham Lincoln was a backwoods barbarian who was undereducated and had no capacity to deal with the issues of disunion, and it was just doomed. And he sent that letter to a friend of his who was down and out on his luck, selling firewood on a corner in Ohio in his hometown. And that friend name was Ulysses Grant. And they last saw Lincoln together at City Point in Virginia at the headwaters of the James River at the Union Army's encampment shortly before the war ended. And it was the last time they saw Lincoln. He talked about his vision for reconciliation in the country. And when Sherman was asked to reflect on Lincoln's life after his assassination, he said that he had met all the great men of the world. He had met the industrialists, he had met the kings, the emperors, the generals, but he had never met any man who possessed more of the qualities of greatness and kindness in his heart than Abraham Lincoln. And what's always been true about the country is that it's produced leaders almost providentially at the right moment. You know, Dwight Eisenhower was a colonel in the Army who hadn't been promoted in 12 years in 1940. Rosa Parks was just a lady who wanted to go home and was too tired to get up from her seat. And a young Baptist minister in Atlanta, right, who became a global force for justice in ordinary people.
Right.
And so when you look at Joe Biden and you look at his story, we look at it, the Lincoln Project, right? We have expectations of greatness from Joe Biden.
Okay.
Because the Joe Biden that we see getting ready to step on this debate stage is a man, 3 times he ran for president. He's been in public service since he was 29, but he's reached the hour of his destiny. And the choice that Joe Biden very specifically presents in this race is the choice between a good man and a bad man, a decent man and an indecent man, an honest man and a dishonest man, a recognized global statesman and an international laughingstock. And we have someone who has the potential, through his empathy, through his goodness, through his decency, through his love of country and his inability to see people that he disagrees with as the enemy. We have the potential to put that man into power, which we think is a prerequisite for an American restoration so this country doesn't slide into an abyss.
Okay. Well, I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed this conversation. And Rick, I'm sorry you didn't get a word in edgewise. So next time, the two of you will need to actually come to the National Press Club so that we can actually give you the National Press Club mug in person. Thank you so much for joining us. And until the next time, thank you so much for having us.